Hi everyone, good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. I'm Hira Jaleel. I'm a visiting assistant professor at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. And today I'll be presenting on my research paper titled Letting the Big Cats Out of the Bag, a case for federal prohibition of exotic big cat ownership in Pakistan. My paper essentially compares the regime for exotic big cat ownership in Pakistan and the US to try and see what lessons Pakistan can learn from the US because they have very similar constitutional structures, as I'll be talking about in a bit. So, the reason why I chose to focus on this particular issue for my research is because back in 2022, I saw this news story. I mean, actually, it's not just in 2022. The issue had been on my radar for a while, and I'll talk a bit about why. But this kind of lit that spark where the Lahore Zoo, which is the biggest zoo in the or basically the biggest zoo in the city I used to live in, Lahore, Pakistan, was auctioning lions off for sale to private buyers, right? And this was quite concerning for animal advocates as well as environmental advocates, because obviously once the lions go into private ownership, they can be freely bred and sold, and there's a burgeoning industry for the breeding and sale of these animals, as I'll be discussing in a minute. And so this led to a lot of public outcry, and the Lahore Zoo eventually said that we won't auction these lions off, and they reneged on the auctioning. However, that didn't really address the root cause of the issue, which is overpopulation of lions in the zoo. Right. So, because there has been in recent years, and by recent years, I mean over the past decade or so, a proliferation of exotic big cat ownership and breeding in Pakistan, the legal landscape governing private ownership and breeding is very murky. It's not, Pakistani laws aren't necessarily designed to keep this activity in mind, which has led to a lot of problems, public safety issues, animal welfare issues. And so my research looks into what that legal landscape is and compares it to the US, which has similarly had a problem with big cat overpopulation and private breeding and ownership of big cats, which has recently, or at least back in 2022, been resolved through the passage of the Big Cat Public Safety Act. So, kind of going back a little bit to the problem and briefly discussing it, lions, specifically African lions, have become almost ubiquitous in Pakistan. You see them everywhere. You see people walking them on leashes. You see people keeping them in their bedrooms. You see them in cages. You see them driving around in cars. It's really become a case where, not of course across the board, but for many segments and in certain areas of the country, lions have replaced dogs. They symbolize wealth. They symbolize political. Oh, sorry. Say hi to my little kitten, my own little cat here. Um, but yeah, so sorry for that interruption. It's become a big problem, right? And the reason why people have or keep lions as pets are, or in private ownership, are a few, right? So one is, of course, companionship. Like I said, they've almost come to replace dogs. They're also symbols of wealth and status. They're a source of revenue because they can be privately bred and sold. So you have private wildlife breeding farms who have turned lion breeding into a source of revenue for themselves, as well as certain political parties in Pakistan, such as the political party that's actually currently is currently formed the government. Their election symbol is a lion. And so you would often see in their political rallies people bringing actual live lions and tigers to kind of show their loyalty to the political party itself. But I mean, I think I don't need to necessarily go into why it's a problem here. It's almost like preaching to the choir, but I will still briefly go over why this is, of course, such an issue. It's a public safety concern. Lions have previously attacked people, including children. There was a social media influencer a couple of years ago who was almost attacked while filming a TikTok video with a captive lion. It's obviously an animal welfare concern. These animals are kept in confinement. They're not domesticated lions, not that there's such a thing, right? They're wild animals. Confinement is obviously bad for them for the same reasons that confinement in zoos is bad for them. But I think when we talk about private ownership, it becomes a little bit more complicated because we don't necessarily have people who are experts in like lion nutrition or necessarily know how to provide the best care for these animals. They often declaw the lions, which again, as we know in cats, can be really dangerous and for them and can lead to chronic pain. Obviously, these lions are abused when they are or they're susceptible or they're vulnerable to abuse because people want them to behave like dogs, but of course they can't because they're lions. They're also unnecessarily sedated because they're often used as props in videos and pictures. And then zoos are running out of space, right? So even when lions do get confiscated by the government, because African lions went extinct in the Indian subcontinent, I believe back in the 1830s, there's really nowhere they can relocate these lions. So they are eventually sent to a domestic zoo, and zoos are running out of space, hence kind of going back to that first slide I showed you where the Lahore Zoo was aiming to auction them off. Here's just some more pictures of lions, the lion cubs specifically. The first one's being used as a prop for a wedding photo shoot, and the second one, this is a recently declawed, freshly declawed lion cub at a veterinarian's office. And then of course, this is because lions are a public safety threat, there's also a threat to the lions themselves. As late as December 2024, we see that a lion escaped someone's house and was then shot by a private security guard. So we see here that there's a risk, of course, to the public and to children, but there's also a risk to these animals themselves because there's really nowhere to go for them if they do escape. So kind of moving on to the legal regime, how does one acquire a lion if one were to want to keep one, right? In Pakistan, the first option is to import a lion from abroad. This we saw, and it kind of tracked CITES data for this, and we see that the stats are kind of reducing over time because like I said, the domestic industry is growing larger to breed lions, and so there's less of a need to import them from abroad, which of course then leads to more kind of problems because they're all very genetically similar. They're probably weaker. Their immune systems are compromised. You could of course purchase a captive bred lion from a wildlife breeding farm, or you could sell or purchase a lion in private ownership. So if I have a lion, I could sell one to you. Or like we just saw in rare cases, you could purchase them from zoos. So African lions are a CITES listed species. So CITES, for those of you who might not be familiar, is the Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, and it's the international convention that puts in place trade control for threatened and endangered species of wild animals. So Pakistan is a party to CITES and has enacted implementing legislation called the Trade Control of Fauna and Flora Act 2012. Because African lions are in Appendix 2 for CITES, the trade control requirements are less strict than they would be if they were in Appendix 1. They're only the country that's sending lions to Pakistan needs to issue an export permit. The export permit needs to be based on needs to be issued after a few findings have been made by the relevant authorities, such as that the trade will not be detrimental to the African lions in the wild, that the lion is lawfully obtained, and that there is minimal risk of injury and cruelty, right? But the domestic act and countries, of course, are free to enact stricter requirements than CITES puts in place. So CITES requirements are a floor. Countries are free to go above and beyond. So the 2012 Act does impose also an import permit requirements under the 2012 Act. You don't necessarily, even if a species is listed in CITES Appendix 2, you would still need an import permit or a no objection certificate for that animal. But it's really vague because it's not entirely clear which species someone needs to obtain an import permit for versus a no objection certificate. So the provision isn't entirely clear on that. And there's, of course, also a captive bred exemption. The captive bred exemption is also in CITES, allows state parties to accept a captive bred certificate in lieu of permits. And the importer only needs these certificates from Pakistan's management authority and the exporting country authority. So then once, if there's like a captive bred, if you can claim that the animal is captive bred, you basically are able to circumvent a lot of these CITES requirements, and CITES becomes a little bit less useful there, right? And we see here that in Pakistan, almost all of the imported lions since 2005 up till 2022, which is when I published this paper, were stated to be captive bred. So, which essentially means that even these export and import permit requirements were circumvented in these cases, right? Also, there's no federal jurisdiction once the animal is in the country. So the 2012 Act is, so the 2012 Act, sorry, is a federal law. And that makes sense because if you're importing animals and exporting them, that's usually federal jurisdiction. However, once the animal is in the country, federal jurisdiction ends because states have, or provinces in Pakistan specifically, have jurisdiction over animals that are over wildlife essentially, and also animal cruelty. So let's suppose I am in Punjab, which is one of the provinces in Pakistan, and I'm importing a lion. I will need to follow federal procedures to actually import the lion. But as soon as the lion is inside the country, it's the Punjab provincial law that starts applying, right? So talking about like the second source and where provincial law plays a more major role is private breeding farms, right? So I've already mentioned a couple of times that they are also a source of lions. There are 280 private breeding farms in Punjab alone, as per the Punjab Wildlife Authority. Wildlife conservation and management are provincial matters. And so when I surveyed provincial laws and the provincial legal landscape for my research, I realized that we can kind of group these laws into three categories, right? Either they're permissive of breeding and possession of exotic animals, either they prohibit breeding and possession, or they're a little bit ambiguous, right? And it's actually the province Punjab which is ambiguous about breeding and possession, where most of these animals are being bred and sold, right? So that creates a loophole in the law. So briefly to talk about the permissive laws, two of the provinces, which are Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, they're very permissive, right? So the law envisions that you can breed exotic species, including and you can keep them as pets. So in Balochistan, we see that the law allows captive breeding of exotic species for reintroduction, for keeping pets, internal trade or export, allows possession and exhibition with a certificate. In Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is another province, it allows the government to register and regulate the operation of breeding facilities for exotic animals. So again, it's a regulated activity, and the law envisions that, it will happen. Then we talk about Punjab, which is ambiguous. So what the Punjab government does, or what the Punjab law does, is that it allows licenses to be issued for private wildlife breeding farms breeding wild animals, right? So there is a regulatory scheme in place for private wildlife breeding farms. However, the term wild animal is not is a term of art, so it's legally defined as one of the species that are listed in a schedule to the act, right? And when you actually look at the schedule to the act, you see that all of the species listed are indigenous species. So it actually doesn't cover any exotic animals at all. And under Pakistan's kind of jurisprudence has been established by the Supreme Court and higher courts. And I mean courts, high courts, and the Supreme Court. There's no court higher than the Supreme Court. The government can't exercise powers that aren't expressly authorized by law, right? So the government can't assume a power that the law doesn't grant it. But we see that the Punjab Wildlife Department does issue licenses to breed lions to private wildlife breeding facilities, breeding lions fairly regularly, right? But on the other hand, the law also doesn't prohibit breeding exotic animals. So there's also that competing principle of law that says that, well, anything not prohibited by the law is allowed, right? So what does that mean? Does that mean that it's allowed but completely unregulated. So the department actually has no say, has no jurisdiction over lions and people are privately breeding and possessing. And if that is the case, then we can probably surmise that that's very problematic in and of itself, right? And litigation on this issue has not really resolved the problem. And then we have Sindh, which is another province, which actually prohibits breeding and possession. So it encourages captive breeding of native species only, prohibits all forms of, prohibits all forms of capture, possession, and trade unless expressly allowed, covers all species of wildlife, including those brought into the province from other provinces or countries. However, again, we see that even though the law is prohibitive in this case, there are still wildlife breeding facilities in Sindh, including Karachi, which is one of the biggest cities in Pakistan. We see has at least 30 big cat wildlife breeding farms. And, captive bred animals can only be kept for education, awareness, and research under Sindh's law, but it may be difficult for the department to determine the purpose, especially if the animals are also being exhibited, right? So it's again a complicated regime, and just because uh the law is on the books, it's only as good as enforcement, right? And we see that in the case of Sindh, the enforcement isn't great. Um, so what does this mean? This means that the federal government allows imports, but then has no authority. It doesn't regulate interprovincial transport, sale, and purchase of big cats, including online. So if I am breeding a cat in one province and selling it in another, and then transporting um the animal cross country, the law is silent on what we don't know what law governs. Provincial laws are inconsistent and they allow loopholes, like I just talked about. If Sindh starts enforcing its restriction, which we see that it's not doing, breeding farms can still set up shop elsewhere, right? So just even if we do have one or two provinces really cracking down on this activity, it's not going to mean it doesn't even need to go underground. It just needs to go somewhere where there's a more favorable environment for this sort of a business, right? Also, loss of licensing revenue is a disincentive for the departments in Punjab and Sindh to enforce the law, because they do make money off of licensing fees. And we see that historically they have been regulating these facilities, even though technically the law doesn't allow them to. It's hard to get provinces to enact all similar laws. And so I think the real solution can only be at a federal level, just because of all of these complications. So that had me turning to the US as an example, just because the US and Pakistan have very similar constitutional schemes. They both have enumerated powers of the federal government in the constitution. Anything that's not expressly given to the federal government is for the states to legislate on. And also, the US had a similar problem controlling the spread of exotic big cat ownership, right? So 5,000 to 15,000 tigers live in captivity in the US, while there's only 4,000 in the wild. They're also mostly used in the US for photo ops and for roadside zoos. And we see that in the US as well, incremental regulation did not work in kind of clamping down on this activity. So again, a brief overview of the US legal framework. We have federally, we have the Lacey Act, which makes it illegal to import or export wildlife in violation of federal, state, and local laws. In 2003, Congress passed the Captive Wildlife Safety Act, which made it illegal to buy, sell, transport, or acquire big cats in interstate or foreign commerce. However, this did not really address breeding and private possession, only made transport across state lines of big cats a little bit more difficult. However, one could still breed, sell, and transport big cats with an exhibitor's license from the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. And this actually ended up encouraging exhibition of big cats, right? So where if you previously had a big cat you just wanted as a companion, now you could just get a license to exhibit, and that would make it easier for you to comply with the law. And then, so we see that regulation of exotic pet ownership was and is largely left up to the states. So as of 2022, 19 states had comprehensive bans on exotic pet ownership. 13 states had a mixed approach where only some dangerous animals were banned or a permit system was implemented. Some states actually had a kind of a free-for-all, so no permit or license system and no ban. So big cats could, again, similar to Pakistan, be bred, sold, purchased, and exhibited within a state with ownership-friendly laws. So to resolve this issue, we saw that Congress passed the Big Cat Public Safety Act into law in December 2022, which amended the Lacey Act and prohibited private possession and breeding of big cats, except for registered facilities. And the restriction on breeding and possession now applies regardless of whether you're actually transporting those animals across state lines, right? So not just to big cats in the stream of commerce, but to all big cats everywhere in the US. It again exempts those with exhibitors licenses, but then also places restrictions on those facilities. So again, if you're running a roadside zoo that allows someone to cuddle a tiger cub for pictures, you can't do that anymore because there needs to be a 15-foot distance or permanent barrier during exhibition. It doesn't really do anything about those who already possess big cats. So if you already have a big cat, you just need to register your cat with the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And then basically the idea is that once the existing animals all die out, because there's a ban on acquiring new animals, the number of animals in captivity is going to go down, right? What this act actually achieves is that, firstly, it does away with this reliance on state laws. I was talking about how difficult it is in Pakistan to have all 4 provincial governments enact the same kind of law. It's even tougher in the US, right? We have 50 states, and it's almost virtually impossible to have 50 states enact the same law or the same kinds of restrictions. The bans actually reduce enforcement barriers because there are fewer entities to license, and there's actually fewer animals that the agency needs oversight on, right? Reduces threat to public safety. And while the long-term efficacy of the act remains to be seen because it's only been two something years since it's been passed, we see that, firstly, the Fish and Wildlife Service already made rules to register animals under existing animals under the law, and we see that some successful prosecutions are already underway under this law. So that led me to conclude that one federal law implementing a nationwide ban on the import, export, transport, sale, purchase, breeding, and ownership of big cats is the solution for Pakistan, right? If Pakistan wants to address this problem at all. There is a constitutional basis for such a law. In fact, there are several constitutional bases for it. For example, the federal government is responsible for implementation of international treaties, is responsible for interprovincial trade and commerce, is responsible for interprovincial matters and coordination. So all of those different heads allows the federal government to legislate on this issue. Then, in terms of what the actual law should look like, the legislation needs to cover as many species of big cats as possible. So tigers, jaguars, cougars, leopards, all hybrids. There needs to be a prohibition instead of a regulation because the regulation is too burdensome and it allows for loopholes like I've already established. There needs to be a prohibition on the sale, purchase, and transfer between private individuals and government-run zoos. So no auctions, the way the Lahore Zoo is doing, and to prohibit direct contact with big cats because of photo ops or having those animals be props for people to take pictures with is an incentive for people to acquire them. Then we need to do away with that incentive. In terms of updates, in 2024, Parliament did pass a new federal wildlife law for Islamabad, which called for the surrender of animals within 3 months. Otherwise, they would be seized. It allows, and sorry, I guess the slide is missing this, surrender of exotic animals, right? So the idea being that existing people who are who are right now owning animals illegally will have to surrender those animals within 3 months, otherwise the animals will be seized. It allowed the breeding of exotic animals by the public sector facilities, so like government-run zoos, but not private individuals. Did not prohibit the import of exotic animals, and no wild animal welfare provisions, right? Oops. And for Punjab, the Punjab government is trying to amend the Punjab Wildlife Act to regulate big cat ownership and establish special wildlife courts for wildlife crimes. Again, but like I said, regulation is not a solution. So both of these laws I personally find to be inadequate, because I do think a comprehensive ban, like I propose in my paper, is really the way to go for Pakistan to meaningfully address this problem. But we see that bills that have been proposed, or conversations that have been had since I published my research, are headed in somewhat the right direction, but I don't think they're going to do much unless there's an absolute ban on the issue, on the activity, and that too on a federal level. So yeah, thank you so much. And this is my email for anyone who has any follow-up questions or wants to reach out. If you're doing research on something on this or something similar, I'd love to hear from you as well. Thank you.